Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful lunch. My name is David Downs. I'm a news reporter at leafly.com. Thanks so much for coming back from your lunch and hanging with us this afternoon at the Wine and Weed Conference. Thank you to the Hyatt. Thank you to the wonderful caterers. How good was that food? That was the best salmon I've had in a while. So we're here for some more learnings. Today, this afternoon, you're very lucky to be graced with one of the true influencers in cannabis right now. I've seen her Instagrams in Vogue, for example, in Vogue magazine, where they've been reaching out to her. HelloMD, for those of you who don't know, wrote a lot of cannabis recommendations here in California and really sort of pioneered that space in telemedicine. And as well as evolved into, from my perspective as a journalist, becoming a go-to resource for a lot of basic cannabis information that people have needs for and continue to have tons of needs for. Along the way, HelloMD has learned probably more than almost anybody else about the cannabis consumer and where they're sort of going. So Pamela's gonna spend a half hour explaining some of the learnings over at HelloMD, as well as better describing her own biography. And then we'll jump up for some moderated questions. Everybody give a warm afternoon round of applause to Pamela Hadfield, HelloMD.
Thank you so much to David Downs, who, David, your new title is Bureau-in-Chief, correct? Yeah, Bureau-in-Chief at Leafly. And when you talk about influencers, I learn a lot from David, and David has been in this industry for a long time. Is probably one of the strongest voices in cannabis. So I appreciate you being here and introducing me. And thank you to Wine and Weed, and to, again, an amazing lunch. So today I'm going to talk to you about emerging trends in cannabis. It's a topic I love to talk about just because I've been in this industry for about 5 years now. And one of the most unique things about this industry is that it never, ever stops. I'm guessing that about half of the people in this room are probably in the cannabis industry. Who works in the cannabis industry? And you've survived. Well, welcome to all of you, but the interesting thing about being in this nascent market and marketplace is that there are many, many different reasons why it never sits still. We're sitting in the state that was the first medically legal state in the country. And we've seen a lot of different changes over the years, changes in regulation. We see that the federal government is still classifying cannabis as a Schedule I drug. It's a brand new industry that's treated like a business, and yet often it's not. And because of all of these different factors, things move at, I would say, sort of a rocket pace. So one of the joys of my job is actually sort of being on that rocket and seeing from the inside what is actually going on in the industry and seeing the patterns that emerge. So what I'm going to talk to you today about are the trends that I see and the things that are happening. Hi, Dimitri. So one of the first trends is cannabis going mainstream. Now I'm starting with this macro trend because it's kind of an interesting one. Some might say in this room that cannabis has been mainstream for some time. I would argue that really 2018 to 2019 is where we're going to see that the tipping point in terms of the conversation around cannabis, the destigmatizing of it, and just the common vernacular. I always like to think about California as its own country. I think that in many ways it is. And with all of the states and everything that's going on, we have 30 medically legal states and DC, and we have 9 recreationally legal states. What this is doing is it's forcing the conversation across the country. We see that 64% of the population right now is in favor of legalizing medical marijuana, and of that percentage, 51% of Republicans are actually pro-legalization as well, which is an interesting turn. Actually, it's 90% is pro-medical marijuana laws. So what we see right now is that there's a general acceptance within society. We may not see that in terms of the regulation that's happening, but we also see that mainstream media is accepting cannabis. I think that when we look at O Magazine and they do a large spread on cannabis, or we look at Goop, Gwyneth Paltrow's platform and that they're talking about cannabis so readily, it changes the conversation across the nation. And in California, although we think that everyone is pro-cannabis all the time, it's still making its way into our lives. The big sort of bellwether change that I have seen is that east of the Rockies, when you go to a Vogue magazine, when you go into these sort of major publications, they're now willing to actually talk about cannabis in their pages. Leafly, obviously, is a cannabis publication and has been talking about it, but when you look at the New York Times, when you look at Vogue, when you look at Forbes, and their willingness to accept this and write about it, that's going to change how we all accept it, because we are shaped by the media around us. The other thing that is happening is that with the medical legalization across the states, everyone is being touched by cannabis right now. So, when somebody has a sick relative and they go from unwell to well, people are going to talk about it. When your life has changed, whether it's you're sleeping better, whether it's anxiety or stress is a little bit lower, you're going to talk about cannabis. And so that's also forcing this issue, forcing it to go mainstream. And then I see one of the last drivers of why cannabis is going mainstream is that people are starting to realize that cannabis is actually, it's not just a vice. It's not something that you just do on a Friday night. It actually might be good for health and wellness. So that's why I believe cannabis is going mainstream in the next year to 2 years. The next trend is the acceptance of cannabis as a tool for health and wellness. Now, I always like to say that cannabis isn't actually a silver bullet for most people. If you've got problems in your life, if you have real health issues, it may be one of the tools that you use, but it's not necessarily going to solve all of your problems. For me, actually, it did solve all of my problems because I suffered from migraines for 25 years. And I'll go into that a little bit more, but after 25 years of migraines and trying all different kinds of medications, cannabis actually prevented them. And so for me, it was this aha moment of, wow, I could go from unwell to well. I could go from feeling terrible to feeling good. And everybody wants to feel good. So what's interesting about the health and wellness component when you talk about cannabis is we're stuck in this way of speaking about things, which is very black and white. We talk about cannabis in terms of recreational, and we talk about it in terms of medical. I really disdain this way that we talk about it because it puts it into two very polar opposite categories. The reality is that you have about 10 to 13% of the market that will always be within recreational. But the interesting thing about that is that the people that are truly recreational, that quote unquote stoner, that guy who lives in the basement of his mom's house and plays video games all the time, that is somebody that cycles into cannabis and cycles out. So people talk about recreational and they have this sort of notion and stereotype about what it is, but that's a portion of the population. On the other side of the spectrum, we have what's called the medical patient. These people exist and they do need to be served, but that's about 6 to 8% of the total population of cannabis consumers. So when you think about truly medical, I think about stage 4 cancer. I think about people that are in hospice. You talk about the epileptic children. Those are the medical consumers. They exist, they need to be served. But what's going on in the middle is this bell curve of health and wellness. So what we've noticed after seeing about 100,000 patients in California and speaking to a lot of them, we've talked to every single patient that's come through. The interesting thing is that most people that come to us, I would qualify them as either compromised health or sort of a lifestyle consumer. And what's interesting about that is if you start out as a lifestyle consumer, say somebody in their mid-30s who comes back to cannabis after not trying it since college, a lifestyle consumer is somebody who just wants to relax on a Friday night. That person often will cycle into using it for more health and wellness concerns like insomnia or anxiety. And somebody like myself, who wasn't truly, truly medical but had compromised health, would never have considered being a lifestyle consumer before, but now, after it solved some of my health issues, I now might consume it to feel a little bit better on a Friday night. That's still health and wellness. If you end up taking some cannabis to decrease stress, that's for your health, that's for your own wellness. So people are starting to look at cannabis in a very different way as a tool for wellness. And that's something I'm really excited about because I believe that this should be accessible to everyone for that reason. And the millions of people poised to come into this market are going to be the health and wellness people. And they're going to be incentivized to do this because somebody like you talked to them, somebody like Marcia, who's my milligram of microdosing. She's going to convince people, you know what, this might be for you because, you know, it could help you feel better and you could take small amounts. I talk in public a lot about cannabis as the exit drug to the opioid epidemic. I want to go back to the story about my migraines. So after many, many years of suffering from these terrible chronic migraines, and I tried every pharmaceutical and they made me into zombies, I settled on Vicodin because Vicodin was the only drug that allowed me to remain semi-functional and to take away a little bit of the pain. I was lucky in that my migraines cycled in and out, so I wasn't on Vicodin all the time. I wouldn't say that I was addicted to Vicodin, but I would say that I was highly dependent on it. So I count myself as very, very lucky. But there was not a day or a place I went where I didn't have Vicodin in my pocket. That's how anxiety-ridden I was about being struck with a migraine. If I had gotten up on this stage to give you all a talk, migraine just would have come out of nowhere. So the interesting thing about starting a cannabis treatment protocol for myself was that within 3 months, I was managing my pain effectively, and I noticed I had left my Vicodin behind. Within 6 months, I was preventing my migraines altogether. And for the past 5 years, I haven't had one migraine after having them chronically for 25 years. So one of the reasons why I started HelloMD was that I realized that if a suburban mom like me, who really wasn't interested in cannabis, could suddenly try it, have it work for a medical condition, and be converted into, cannabis for health and wellness, and get off of opioids, there had to be a lot more people out there just like me. But specifically 5 years ago, I was very interested in the notion that cannabis could be a treatment for people to get them off of opioids. It was just a hunch, but the reality is it is very efficacious in allowing people to either reduce or eliminate opioid use altogether. This is a national epidemic. 70,000 people across North America, that's counting Canada, are dying every year from opioid overdoses. If we can introduce cannabis into treatment regimes, either before or during opioid use, the mortality rate will go down dramatically. HelloMD did one of the largest studies to date on chronic pain, cannabis, and opioids. And 3,000 patients were surveyed about introducing cannabis into their treatment protocol. The fascinating thing was, once they started to use cannabis, it actually increased the efficacy of the opioids, and they decreased their consumption. 97% of people indicated that they decreased or eliminated use of opioids altogether. Now, when you're talking about 91 people dying every single day, that's an amazing statistic. So we did a survey, but there's a lot of new research out there that's mimicking exactly what we found. 80% of the people that we surveyed also indicated that they found that cannabis was a better treatment for chronic pain. There are plenty of studies out there right now that indicate that cannabis is better for chronic pain. Opioids were created not for the treatment of chronic pain, but for the treatment of acute pain. Chronic pain is anything that lasts longer than 30 days. Acute pain, 2, 3, 4 days. Post-op surgery, that sort of thing. So the biggest hurdle I see in terms of the adoption, the widespread adoption of cannabis as the exit drug to the opioid epidemic, is not general consumers. It's the general practitioners that continue to not look at the research, to not accept cannabis as a valuable treatment. And the interesting thing about cannabis and the industry and the market that we're in today and the ability of everyone in this room is for you to bring that to your doctor, because cannabis flips medical care on its head. because right now doctors, mainstream doctors, are not willing to accept it. I'm finding that there's a pattern with anesthesiologists and also, interestingly enough, the whole field of psychotherapy. Why? Because they're the ones that are seeing the addiction over and over and over. So I urge everyone in this room to talk to your doctor about that. So this, I struggled with this one as sort of a micro-macro trend because Big Pharma isn't really a trend, right? Big Pharma just is. But the question I get asked pretty frequently is, well, what's the pharmaceuticals industry going to do? Where are they going? What's happening? Aren't you afraid? It's an interesting topic, and I think right now, Big Pharma is not a threat to the cannabis industry. Big Pharma is not en masse coming into the cannabis industry and going to just take cannabis and run with it. Why? Because of the federal government, the fact that it's a Schedule I drug. But the interesting thing is that I see a lot of undercurrents of what's happening with Big Pharma in the cannabis industry. And my prediction is that within 2 to 5 years, assuming that federal law changes and it goes out of Schedule I status, cannabis that is, that Big Pharma will swoop in. I know there's a lot of word on the street in different parts of the country of Big Pharma actually owning cannabis farms. That's anecdotal and rumors, but I do hear about that. But the big pharmaceutical company that's betting on cannabis right now is GW Pharma. And they're based in the UK. The FDA just approved, I can never say it, Epidiolex, their anti-seizure medication. And I think the unique thing about that medication is that they're actually using whole plants in there. I think that's correct, right, David? Yeah. So, and the reason I mention that is because whole plant in pharmaceuticals is a little bit different. One of the things that prohibits, or a lot of the thinking from Big Pharma is, how can we possibly create drugs out of the actual plant? Their tendency is much more to go towards synthetic cannabinoids, developing synthetics out of barley, yeast, rye, different things like that. One of the things that I'm also seeing that's a trend that I think is going to feed into Big Pharma moving in is biotech companies are creating these synthetic cannabinoids. They're doing a lot of research. There's a company up in Canada that's been very successful at creating THC out of, I believe it's yeast. And so they are going to be poised for acquisition by these big pharmas. The last thing that I see that I find interesting about this is that Johnson & Johnson has opened a research laboratory. And so that's interesting too. So all of this is, I just think that it's sort of this undercurrent that's leading towards Big Pharma getting in, but not yet. So the next trend, one size does not fit all. So imagine if you walk into a clothing store and you're looking for a t-shirt. Did you? Okay. So imagine that you walk into a clothing store and you're looking for a t-shirt and all you can see are t-shirts that are 2X and they're all white. When I walked into dispensaries about 5 years ago, what I noticed was that all the products pretty much seemed the same. Depending on the dispensary, a lot of them would be almost entirely all flower and very, very high THC content. And as somebody who is very sensitive to THC, I would talk to the bud tender, the people that advise you, and often, I would say, do you have anything lower in THC? And they would actually laugh at me. They would laugh. They'd be like, no, nobody wants that. And I was like, well, I kind of need that and want that. And they'd say, no, that stuff won't sell. The interesting thing about what's going on right now is that we have demand side. The demand side is pushing innovation and the products that are being put on the dispensary shelves. So we are no longer a one size fits all. We are in a culture right now where we have one of the best product arrays available on the planet. We have incredibly innovative new products coming out all the time. And a lot of them are lower in THC and high in CBD, which is the non-psychoactive portion of the plant, which I think is good news. So moving on from something that I view as quite positive, which is there's a lot of product to choose from, is overregulation. Overregulation has definitely happened in the California cannabis industry. we are at a point where over the last 20 years, we went legal in 1996. We're at the point where we had an incredibly healthy and successful industry. The best innovative products on the market, bar none. I've heard that from a lot of people that come down from Canada and say, we come down to California not because of your cannabis grows, because they're only like 20,000 feet and we've got like 1 million square feet. We come down to look at your product selection. We come down to look and see what you guys are making and doing. Since Prop 64 passed and since January 1st, the cannabis industry has basically been decimated by overregulation within the state of California. We went from having probably, 1,500 dispensaries operating legally prior to that to about 300 in the state. We went from having over 1,000 brands to having just 150 or so compliant legal brands in the state today. We have a situation where in the Emerald Triangle, you have generations of farmers that have been successfully growing cannabis and who now are being driven out of business by overtaxation. The taxation situation is absolutely crazy. And as David Downs said in his Michael Krasny KQED podcast this past week, we have a grapes of wrath type situation up there. We also have what I think is the biggest travesty of overregulation, which is Californians were basically voting to have a legal system so that everyone could have access, because that was the dream. That's what they were sold. But the reality is that 70% of the state right now is practically dry. 70%. Now, when you think about a patient, I think about myself. If I couldn't get access to medication, what that would mean, it'd probably drive me to the black market. But when you look at all of these medical patients across California and patients who actually need access and they are not given access because local municipalities have deemed it, unsafe to have cannabis dispensaries or delivery within their jurisdiction, it's just wrong. So I like to think about regulators like I think about carpenters. If you give a carpenter a hammer, they're going to find a bunch of nails. They've found way too many nails in this situation, and they are driving an entire industry out of business. You basically have to be a rocket scientist in order to operate a business in this state right now. So that's the really sort of dark side of the regulatory situation that we're in right now. I will point out two positives of what's happened. And this was what they were saying that they would like to do when regulation went into effect. And that is that you have thousands of people that are coming out of jails and prison right now, records being expunged. That's great. And the second thing is that we are now being delivered safe products. I think they're testing for over 150 pesticides. How many? 67. Still a lot of pesticides. So you can be sure that the product that you buy legally, although it's more expensive, is actually going to be safe. So microdosing. This has actually been a trend that's been on the rise for quite some time. So microdosing is the idea that you take the minimum amount of cannabis or any other substance to create the maximum overall beneficial effect. So the interesting thing about microdosing is that I said to you 5 years ago I couldn't find anything that was low THC. Now you walk into a dispensary or you go to a delivery service and there are tons of products to choose from. And microdosing is exciting in that if you're talking about cannabis being a tool for health and wellness, this is the on-ramp for new people coming in. I like to think about microdosing like, if you compare it to wine, right? If you drink a whole bottle of wine, most people won't feel very good. The first glass you feel good, second glass you feel good. By the third glass, you're kind of not feeling so great. Fourth glass might be too much, and then you're probably not going to sleep well, and you're not going to feel good the next day. Most people, or a lot of people I can say, when they start with cannabis, they actually have that macrodose experience, and it scares them off of trying cannabis again. So when you talk about microdosing and on-ramping people in, this is like giving them that sort of half glass of wine, right? And just allowing them to try it and try it safely and to titrate up. So we're seeing an enormous amount of products by a variety of brands right now that offer very low dose, microdosed products. I love this one, weight management. Anyone in this room, take this one and run with it, because I think there's $1 billion industry around cannabis for weight management. And you don't hear this very much, but the reality is cannabis consumers tend to have a lower BMI and a smaller waist size than non-cannabis consumers. Now you could say that's sort of negligible, but THC has many different components within it that actually changes your gut microbiome. It actually can help speed up your metabolism. The other interesting thing is that CBD has been found in new research to also boost metabolism, but it also will convert white fat cells to browning fat cells. And browning fat cells actually, they burn energy much more quickly. So the reason I like to talk about this is because I had 3 kids in under 4 years, which I don't recommend to anyone. It's a bad idea. And as a result, I wasn't in great health. I was overweight, and I struggled to lose the weight. I was eating well, I was exercising, I was like, I'm just gonna be thick. But I started on the CBD for my migraines, and within about 6 months, I was maintaining a weight that was lower than my weight when I was in college. And I was like, that's so weird. I couldn't quite figure it out. So I started to think, well, maybe there's a correlation. And I talked to some scientists, and they're like, weird. There's no sort of correlation between CBD use and that, and so on and so forth. Well, now there is some new research out there. So if you're interested in weight management, CBD, daily doses of that may actually help. Sure. Other cannabinoids. I'm going to go through these 2 slides quickly. So cannabinoids are the different components in the plant that actually create therapeutic value. So CBD and THC, 2 most common ones. But what we're seeing today is that there are now a ton of new cannabinoids that you can select on dispensary shelves and have delivered to your door. And many of them are what is known as isolates. And so some examples of those would be CBG, which is actually helps promote bone growth, antispasmodic as well. One is called CBN. You have THCA. You have THCV. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these, but the interesting thing is you will start to see these names more and more and more, and all of them have different therapeutic benefits. And when you take the whole plant together and all of those cannabinoids, in addition to THC and CBD, they have tremendous therapeutic value. And the last one, terpenes. Terpenes are amazing. They're part of the cannabis plant that create that aromatic smell. They're basically essential oils. Terpenes have been shown to have incredible therapeutic value as well. Now, most of the products that you'll buy other than flower won't necessarily talk about myrcene, pinene, linalool. But terpenes are not just in cannabis, they're also in flowers. They're in many different plants. And so what you'll start to see is that people will be talking about terpenes in addition to cannabinoids when you buy products. Well, this product has linalool, and these are the effects. This is the smell. Pinene, which is that smell of pine. All of these things. It actually, I always thought aromatherapy was a bunch of bull, but now I'm like, oh, I get it. Yeah, it actually does have value. And so that is my talk about emerging trends. Thanks so much for staying with me. And yeah.
Thanks so much, Pamela. Everybody give her a warm round of applause. We're going to do a couple of questions. Terpenes are great. I'm glad you ended there, because Ed Rosenthal, my co-author on Marijuana Harvest this year, likes to say that THC is the engine, but terpenes are the steering wheel and the wheels. And so, yeah, it's going to be great to see terpene profiles start to show up on packages this year. Yeah. If you want to put those on packages, you got to actually get it tested for the first time. Mm-hmm. And so it's a great day and a great year to be into terpenes in California, as all you wine people know. So one of the top questions from the audience was, what trends have come as the biggest surprise to you? You've been doing this for 5 years. It's still happening. What's happening so fast it's sort of, making even you sort of be taken aback?
I think that's an interesting question, because I'm always taken aback in this industry. I'm always taken aback, but I think that the mainstream component of, 2 or 3 years ago, I like to say this quote because it's absolutely true. People would often say to me, in so many words that the industry you're in and what you're doing is very similar to porn and gambling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'll hear some of those in
Yeah.
like the hallowed halls of places like Vogue magazine. Or whatever.
Exactly.
What are you going to do?
Exactly.
Write
And
about
so,
meth next?
welcoming me in was sort
That's
of
an
like a
actual
very
quote.
black sheep sort of feeling, and I
Right.
wasn't welcome in. And this year, it's people want to talk to me or to you, and we're much more socially acceptable. So to me, that's
It seems
interesting.
so shocking because you can be in the bubble 1 minute and then be out of the bubble so fast.
Yeah.
Today I'm writing for Leafly about how Kikoko, a great low-dose tea maker that's taking tons of market share among atypical cannabis consumers, is sponsoring a VIP reception at the San Francisco Conservatory of Flowers tonight. And the conservatory approached the Apothecarium, which is one of the leading dispensaries in the Bay Area, saying, hey, do you want to sponsor free admission Tuesdays here at the conservatory? And they must have found out that the Apothecarium has given out $350,000 in philanthropy over the last couple of years. So it's the new sort of high watermark, cannabis plus the conservatory. And that came after the Exploratorium and the California Academy of Sciences saying, we're going to be okay with interfacing with this a little.
Well, and I also think that what we've seen over the last 5 years, and this has been a big trend in the cannabis industry, is people from business industries. I know the tea ladies well from Kikoko, and they're amazing.
Samantha and Jenny, huh?
Yeah, and they are powerhouse business women.
Fully.
They come in with a spit and polish that wasn't there. I used to think about like coming from a consulting background in Silicon Valley, that when I entered the cannabis industry, it was like stepping over a bar like this high, right? Because a lot of practices weren't that professional. And so I think as business practices and people become more acceptable on that level, we're welcomed in as well.
Yeah, and it's turning into a feedback loop where like we're hiring people from Amazon and Facebook and Google now. They're bringing their A games. It's changing the way the products look. That's bringing in new people and further decreasing stigma, which attracts even more top grade talent. One question for this audience maybe is, what have you learned at HelloMD, and what have you seen in the data with regard to alcohol and wine consumers and beverage drinkers in general, and cannabis? When you think of wine and cannabis intersecting, given your background, what are the trends there from your perspective?
Well, people in the wine industry have all seen the data that alcohol consumption is going down in lieu of cannabis.
Yeah, BDS Analytics said earlier today 57% of people who are consuming both consume less alcohol.
It's somewhere around that. My feeling about wine is that there's a lot of parallels between wine and cannabis. And there may be some eating in on that, but I think that people that are really interested in wine will continue to be interested in wine, and that there still will be a healthy consumption. This is my sort of take on it, is I feel like the bigger piece is probably going to be taken out of harder alcohols.
Right. Yeah, it also strikes me that there's more non-cannabis users to add into the health and wellness fold and the low-dose fold and the low-dose beverage fold than there will be losses in terms of cannabis consumers or alcohol consumers who are drinking less.
And I think you make an interesting point, because I think that the health and wellness consumer often has something in mind, which is, I need to solve this problem with insomnia, right? So they'll take THC at night. Maybe they'll lifestyle consume, but it's not necessarily daily consumption to just feel good.
Right. The second most popular question was, if 43% of cannabis users stop using pharmaceuticals, we've seen reductions in opioid use. We've seen their efficacy for a lot of competing, conditions. How is quote unquote Big Pharma responding to this loss? Do you have any insight, anything you've read or seen in terms of, Pfizer and Bayer and people like that reacting?
Of course they're concerned, and there is $1 billion losses in terms of this, but at the same time with the federal regulations, it's still holding them at bay. But that's where the sort of research and sort of laying the groundwork, I think, is happening. And I have heard that there's a opioid replacement drug that I'm not sure who's working on it, but for chronic pain with cannabinoids.
That's a really interesting group. So, when people ask me how is Big Pharma responding, I think of the story of Arizona last year or 2016, legalization was on the ballot. It lost. It was very close. One of the deciding factors was a $500,000 donation from a company called Insys, which makes opioids. They make a fentanyl spray, which
crazy.
is super dangerous.
Yeah.
And then they got in big trouble for pushing fentanyl and opioids on Americans, and a lot of their former executives are, facing charges. But Insys, reached into their pocket to stop recreational cannabis legalization in Arizona and succeeded, using the sort of political levers that were available to them. And now Insys is trying to market a opioid replacement drug that's based on cannabinoids, called like Subsys or something.
Yeah.
So they literally blocked cannabis people so that they could sell a cannabis product for the addiction that they created under opioids.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys are the devil. You're the devil.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not anti-pharma at all, but when it comes to the creators of opioids and fentanyl and this, we have to be taking a better look at what's actually going on.
Yeah, I see so many people here thinking about such great ideas in terms of products and services. And when I think about what Insys did there, I just want to make sure that everyone remembers the political component, and this isn't by any means over as a political issue in neighborhoods, in communities, let alone in like counties and in states here and even California.
Yeah.
And so any sort of commercial action you're thinking about taking needs to be paired with some political awareness and maybe action as well, right?
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for your time, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. That was great.
Thank
So
you.
we're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and then we're going to start off the next session. So if you need to step out for a second, we're going to talk a little about tourism, cannabis tourism, and its impact on wine.